So good morning, everyone. This is Patricia Townsend from Washington State University. Washington State University is part of Advanced Hardwood Biofuels Northwest, which is a consortium of Pacific Northwest universities and industry working on this 5-year project to develop hybrid poplar as a short rotation crop and turn it into transportation fuels and bio-based chemicals. This project is funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. We have initially awarded a 5-year grant, and recently we've been received a no-cost extension that's going to carry us through 2017, August 2017. So Rick Gustafson from University of Washington is with us today. He is the project lead for AHB. He's going to give us an update on what the project is about. Thank you for filling in our poll questions. I see that we have good representation today from government and also industry, so we are excited to have you join us. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can type them into the chat box, and also questions, you can type them into the chat box and we'll answer questions at the end. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Rick now, and we will get started.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. So what I'm going to do here is talk about some of the things we've learned in the project, and a little bit about where I think things have to go forward to get a renewable fuels and chemicals industry going. Advanced Hardwood Biofuels Northwest is a USDA-funded consortium of universities, and most significantly, we have two main industrial partners, Zeachem and Greenwood Resources. And so it gives the whole project a very strong development component where we're doing fundamental research, but the idea is to translate that into commercial enterprises in the end. Okay. So I should have mentioned our focus here has been to lay the foundation for an industry in the Pacific Northwest making fuels and chemicals, and starting from purpose-grown poplar feedstock. So we want to figure out how to grow the trees in a sustainable fashion, develop efficient biorefineries to convert that into fuels and chemicals. And the product we've been concentrating on in the project are jet fuel, ethanol, and acetic acid. And acetic acid ends up in a lot of paint, and that's why President Obama there is painting with maybe someday acetic acid that's produced from a renewable resource like poplar trees. Before I get into kind of what we've done and where we're going, I want to give some context of why renewable fuels and chemicals are of interest and what the motivation for them are. The main one is climate change. So this plot is from NASA. It shows this temperature anomaly, kind of the temperature above the sort of the mean temperature as a function of time. And of course, like everyone knows here, it's climbing, and it's been climbing. If you look to the far right here, it's been climbing more rapidly the last few years. The last 3 years are the hottest 3 years on record. So this motivation for renewable fuels hasn't gone away. In fact, the story gets worse as we go forward. And so the idea is to try to get us off petroleum and onto more fuels that have a smaller carbon footprint. Another one that was motivating the project when we started back in 2010 was to reduce the amount of oil that was imported to the U.S. And what you can see in this graph is the fraction of petroleum that was imported. And when we started in 2010, it was up around half, maybe a little bit above 50% of the oil used in the U.S. was imported. And because of hydraulic fracking, the domestic supply has increased a lot. And so there's this as a motivator for the project has gone down somewhat, although we still spend a lot of money overseas on oil. Currently, we spend about $300 million per day on imported oil. So clearly, having a stronger domestic supply would have a lot of economic benefits for the country there. And then the last motivating, real motivation for the project, and this is a very significant importance for USDA, which funds this project, is to boost rural economies. If you look at sort of life in rural, the poverty levels are higher. There's more health care problems. Premature death is higher in rural economies. And one of the thinking here is if we could start making fuels and chemicals from crops and biomass grown in rural economies, it would help these rural environments. So those have been the three main motivations. Two are still certainly in play: rural economies and climate change. Of course, that's getting worse. Domestic supply isn't quite such a big issue now, but we're still sending a lot of money overseas. Now the world has changed as far as the fuels go in the last 10 years, and this has had a huge impact on the project. So this is a plot of the crude oil prices over the past 15 years or so. And when we started the project back in 2010, 2011, oil was up over $100 a barrel. And at that point, making fuels, either drop-in fuels or ethanol from feedstock looked pretty economically viable. But since then, again, because of mainly hydraulic fracking, the price of oil has dropped down to about $40 a barrel, which makes it very difficult to compete with if you're making fuels and chemicals from biomass sources. So please keep this in mind as I sort of talk through the project and some of the things we've learned and kind of some of the things where we're going, because it certainly had a big impact on what we've had to do in the research program over the past 5 years or so. Okay, so we in the research or in the project, we have 5 main areas: feedstock conversion, sustainability, education, and extension. And when I used to give talks like this, I would always break it up in the different areas and kind of go through them. But now what's happened is that the project has become so integrated that there's a lot of overlap between the different areas here. So extension provide a lot of information that's helped us in the feedstock area. The conversion and the feedstock groups work together, and then the sustainability encompasses the whole thing. So I won't be breaking down the project in these different areas. I'm just going to be touching on what I think are some of the big important things that we've learned in the project, and you'll see how this all nicely fits together. Yeah, keep doing that. Okay, so the first thing we've learned is we've established that poplar is really an excellent feedstock, and I'll go over why that is. But before we even got into the project, it was well known that poplar is a good biomass to feed to bioconversion processes. You can fractionate it, you can separate the sugars from the lignin quite readily with poplar, and it's a clean biomass source as opposed to agricultural residual, where you have a lot of ash as well as dirt and that kind of thing that come in with it. So it was already well known. There were just some issues about growing it and then harvesting the whole trees that we've established, and we still think it's an excellent feedstock, although as I'll get to in a little bit, its cost is a little bit problematic. Okay, so to investigate how to grow the poplar, we've established 4 tree farms. Actually, we have 5. We have one down in Mississippi too, but 4 in the Pacific Northwest. These are 50 to 100 acres. The nice thing about it is that there are different soils or different climates or different altitudes. We have a number of clones planted on each of the tree farms, so we can really assess how well the trees grow. We can look at soil, we can look at air emissions, we can do a comprehensive assessment on growing poplar as a feedstock for fuels and chemicals. Those of you not familiar with poplar, they use a Coppice system to grow the trees, and so you put a stick in the ground, about 1,500 trees per acre, a poplar stick, and then it shoots out roots and leaves. And after a couple of years, you have a tree that may be 15 feet tall, and you come through and harvest it. And then what the tree does is it sends 3 to 5 shoots off of the stump that's already established there. So now you have a big stump driving the growth of the new trees. And then you allow the trees to grow about another 3 years, and then you come through and harvest them again, and it sends up shoots again. And then 3 years later, you come through and harvest it again. And you have to do this. You might be able to get away with 5 or 6 cycles of this before the stump starts to run out of gas, and then you got to take it out and replant and start over again. The good thing about it is that it's a lot less expensive than most silvicultural methods, because you only have to plant once every 20-some years, and then the harvesting is really cheap, because as you'll see in a bit, you can use a mechanical harvester instead of having a bunch of people out there with chainsaws or something like that. And this whole system, we've discovered, works really well on all the sites. Some grow faster than others, but nonetheless they're all productive. And this is a photograph down in Jefferson, Oregon, and this is our 2-year-old trees after the first coppice. And some of these trees are 20 plus feet tall, and they're almost 5 inches in diameter. And in fact, they're growing so well that we're concerned that by the end of the 3rd year, when we schedule to do the harvest, it might be too big for our harvester to come through and cut them down. They're looking at beefing up the harvester a little bit, but there's some thought we may have to actually do the coppice harvesting every 2 years so the trees don't get too big. Looking at some data that we have here on a couple sites. So Jefferson, this is in Oregon. Hayden, this is in right outside of Spokane. So that's in kind of western Idaho. And what you can see here is that in the 3-year-old trees, you're up around 20 tons per acre, so there'd be on the order of 7 tons per acre per year growth in the highest growing ones. And we believe that this will go up some with the next coppice cycle, because it'll be more established, the root system will be bigger, and as we go forward with the project, picking better clones, there's no reason this couldn't get to 10 tons per acre per year. The yields from this are much higher than if you had single stem plantations. There's a fair amount of variety, and that's good. We're looking for different clones that have different growth rates, so we can figure out which ones that work best. And the big deal is that the growth and yield data generated here is the biggest data set that anyone has on poplar. And so going forward, this data set will be very useful for anyone that wants to grow these trees for whatever purpose. We've established the efficacy of the harvesting system. The harvester was developed in conjunction with a group in New England, another USDA CAP program. What's the name of the dude?
New Bio.
New Bio, yeah. And this Tim Volk, who's been working with the Department of Energy on this, and it's a modified corn harvester. It's got, since it cuts the trees down, grinds them up, and then spits it right into a truck. And what we found in harvesting our tree farms is that it works very efficiently. Can go up and down the rows at about 5 miles an hour. The biggest thing you can do to improve the efficiency is reduce the number of places that the harvester has to turn around. Again, as the trees get bigger, there may be some issues with that, but there's thought that the harvester can get beefed up to work even better. All right, so the not so good news with all this is that it's not an inexpensive feedstock. It's not expensive, but it's not cheap either. This slide here was presented by Jeff Nuss. He's the president of Greenwood Resources, and what he told us is that there's a lot of money out there ready to invest in things like these tree farms because interest rates are so low. People are looking for investments that can yield 5-6%, but are pretty steady, like a tree farm would be if there was an offtake agreement with that. And what he showed here is that the return, so this is a calculated return on some of our tree farms. This is assuming $100 per ton of biomass. And you can get returns on investments on the order of 5-6%, which is what these people are looking for. And Greenwood themselves has something like, I believe, $40 million or so in their kind of portfolio that they think could be invested in this kind of operation here. But the downside there is $100 a ton, if you're going to make a fuel, is pretty expensive for biomass. These days with cheap oil, it had to be down 50 or lower to make a go of it. So this is something that really needs to be addressed. Is there ways that the cost of producing the biomass feedstock can be sort of reduced in there? Because the money's out there, it's ready to go. It's just a matter of being able to have a cost-effective system so everyone can make money off of growing the trees. So in that light, the extension folks here have uncovered or found that a lot of waste treatment facilities are using poplar as sort of the final stage of their waste treatment plants. Now, some of these waste treatment folks are able to sell the poplars, but some don't know quite what to do with them. And we also think that this could be expanded. More waste treatment facilities could be planting poplar, and waste treatment facilities already using poplar could probably use them more effectively. So we think that by providing this ecosystem service of cleaning up water, the cost of, not the cost, but the amount of money that you have to sell the poplar for could come down quite a bit because it's providing the service, and that'd make a cheaper feedstock, as well as increase the demand for the trees, which could help the waste treatment facilities themselves. So we found out there's a lot of municipalities growing poplar as a wastewater treatment tool. This is in Hayden, Idaho, where they're spraying wastewater on poplar trees there. Currently, only a couple percent of municipalities grow poplar. It's only 1,200 acres at this point, but there's a lot of municipalities out there, and they're asking us for help in growing the trees and sometimes figuring out what to do with them when they get too big. It's a habit. So what you can see here is where the few places that are currently using poplar as a wastewater management tool here. There's not a lot in the Pacific Northwest. That those that are there are in regions that are pretty good for biorefineries. Our geospatial optimization work shows that along the west side of the Cascades is a good place for biorefineries, and that's where a lot of these waste treatment facilities are. And in fact, if you look at the whole Pacific Northwest, like in this map, which shows where all the treatment facilities are located, the little triangles, and then the areas that are suitable for growing poplar, you can see there's just a gigantic opportunity to take advantage of all these waste treatment facilities that are often located on places that are good for growing poplar to provide feedstock for future biorefineries. So we think this is just a huge opportunity for the waste treatment facility to do a better job of cleaning up water, and also to provide a feedstock for producing fuels and chemicals. Okay, we've looked at a few other environmental impacts of the tree farms. I'm going to only show one. We've looked at wildlife, we looked at soils. In general, everything looks really good. The environmental impacts are about the same as if you had, well, it's generally less than agriculture land, but it's similar to sort of forest lands and the land that the tree farms came from. So one thing we've looked at is isoprene emissions. These are hydrocarbons that poplars put out, and if you plant the tree farm next to an urban area, the isoprenes can react with emissions from the cars, and that can lead to air quality issues. And what we found here is that different clones have way different isoprene emissions, so if it is a concern, you can always plant the clones that had the lowest emissions in your area. And then when we compared greenhouse emissions compared to agriculture or forest lands, typically we find that the poplar trees are about the same as the agriculture or the forest land. And the same is true for sort of water quality things and soil impacts. So from everything we can tell, the tree farms look like they're pretty healthy. In fact, the animals seem to like them more than if it was just barren land. The extension folks have been out talking to landowners, and they're characterized as becoming more enthusiastic about poplar as they learn more about the crop. Of course, these are conservative folks. They need to make money on the whole thing, so that's important. But in a survey of almost 900 landowners, half of them were interested, and a third of them thought they'd be likely to be growing bioenergy crops in the next 5 years. And of course, they're worried about profit risk, water quality, and then they're interested in renewable energy, so it's good. And here's a couple landowners. These guys are in California. They're the owners of the land that our tree farm is on down there, and they're very enthusiastic about the potential of growing poplar. And I should say this is in contrast to when the project first started. When we first started, farmers were pretty unenthusiastic about this, in large part because of a legacy of planting poplar trees for the pulp and paper industry in the 1980s that did not work out well at all. But over time, many farmers and landowners have warmed up the idea of having this as an alternative crop in their farmlands. All right, so leaving now growing the trees to converting it, the big takeaway we have from the project is that poplar can be efficiently converted to fuels and chemicals at pretty commercial scales. So what I've shown here in the photograph is the Iyear demonstration biorefinery in Boardman, Oregon. So this is a 10-ton per day operation. And the ways this work is we've done work in the laboratory, much of it here at University of Washington and some at Iyear, and then once we get something worked out, we run it through the Iyear demonstration facility to see how it works out on a commercial scale, providing essential data if you want to go ahead and build a full-fledged factory. Okay, so just to give you a little background on the process for producing fuels that we mainly looked at, then this was Iyear's founding technology. But essentially in this project, this process, you start from poplar, and then you fractionate that into lignin and the sugars. The sugars get fermented to acetic acid, and the purpose of this is when you ferment the sugars to acetic acid, all the carbon ends up in the acetic acid. When you go straight to ethanol, you lose about half of the biomass as CO2. And then the acetic acid gets converted to ethyl acetate, and then ethanol, and then if you, at that point, you could sell it as ethanol. But if you want to go all the way to a hydrocarbon fuel, you dehydrate it to make ethylene, and you oligomerize that, put a little hydrogen in there, and then you get a polymer jet fuel. So the products that we get out of this is we get sugars here, although they wouldn't be hard to sell them. But we can recover certainly acetic acid. We can make ethyl acetate, and we could sell ethanol. And you can make ethylene. Ethylene is the largest commodity chemical in the world. And then finally, you can get a polymer fuel. So we can make, out of this process, we can make a variety of chemicals, and then finally a fuel, depending on what the markets are for these different products. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to look into were these whole tree chips, which are not the nice, clean, white chips that people have done research on in the past. And we wanted to find out if they were good for bioconversion processes, like the one I just showed on the previous slide. And the answer is basically they are good. They're not quite as good as the whole tree chip, but of course they're considerably cheaper than that. But one thing that clearly has to be separated from the whole tree chips is the leaves. So if you harvest in the time of year when the leaves are on the trees, there's going to have to be some way to separate them out. When we talk to ag engineering types, they think air separators could work out good, or you can always use a defoliant to take the leaves off the trees before you do the harvest. But what's shown here is the sugars that are recovered per ton of biomass. The two bars on the left are from poplar mixture without leaves, and then the two on the right are poplar mixture with the leaves. And you can see there's a big hit, 160 kilograms per ton, that you lose of sugars by having the leaves on there. What's also shown here is those 5077 and 8019. Those are two different clones, and it shows that the different clones can lead some different yields as well. But the big message is that the leaves really have to go in some fashion or another. But once you get the leaves off, then the bioconversion works out pretty good. So what's shown here again is the sugars that are recovered for three different types of biomass. So something coming out the first coppice cycle, that's 2 years. The second one is the 2-year-old tree from the second coppice cycle. And then the other one is a nice clean 12-year-old chip. And what you could see is that the first coppice cycle has considerably less sugars, and also if you look at the little squares above that, those are the recoveries. And the recovery for the first coppice cycle is only about 60%. But if you compare the next two bars, the second coppice cycle and the 12-year-old popular chips, you can see the recovery is about the same. The second coppice cycle has a little bit less sugar recovery, and that's because it's got less sugar in the biomass. But we think as the trees mature and as they go through further coppice cycles, we'll get more and more of the wood in the center, the white wood, and fewer branches and fewer bark, and the yields of the two systems will be pretty close to each other. Okay, the other thing that we've worked on, besides converting the whole tree chips, is developing a process to produce jet fuel. Zeochem had expertise in going all the way to ethanol, but this was something that they did not know how to do, and we've done some work on that. So again, the process is we start from ethanol, we dehydrate that to ethylene, and then ethylene's a molecule which is a couple carbons. We shove those together to make a molecule that has maybe 10 to 16 carbons, and then you put a little hydrogen in at the end to get rid of the double bond, and you get jet fuel. So what this work is involved is developing a new catalyst and the reaction system to make that happen, and that's been successfully done. Previous work with this, we made a lot of aromatic compounds, which are you don't want that in there. Those lead to soot formation. And aromatics, these are like benzene compounds, are being slowly taken out of jet fuel and other fuels. And so we've been able to successfully at the lab convert ethanol into hydrocarbons, and now we're in the process of scaling that up to make sort of gallon or liter size quantities. With the plan here is to get ASTM certification and start on the route so we can produce jet fuel from poplar trees and try it out in an engine. Okay, all this work has been done at the laboratory, most of it here at University of Washington. And then what happens is that then trials on what we've developed here can be run down at Zeochem, and they've run lots of different trials with Poplar, lots of different conditions. They've been able to get good yields. They run through their process just fine, and they've done fermentation to a variety of products. They've made ethanol at good yield. Tighter, that's the concentration of ethanol or acetic acid in the final product. You'd like that above 50 if you could, because that'll reduce the recovery costs. But we've got pretty good yields and pretty good titers for both of those chemicals. And now, because as I'll talk in a bit, acetic acid does not look like such a good commodity chemical to make. We're starting to do some work with lactic acid and that. And we hope to have that done before the project ends up. All right, we've done a lot of techno-economic work on this, and what we found is that biorefinery to make jet fuel is really expensive. This is a 100 million gallon a year kind of facility that the numbers are shown for here. It's got three major parts: feedstock to ethanol, alcohol to hydrocarbons, and a steam plant and a natural gas reforming to make hydrogen. And all three of these things are commercially viable processes. They're all up and running, so we can check our economic numbers against plants that are already there. And there's no mystery of how these things would all work together, because these are all viable plants, and for the most part you could just kind of shove them together and off it would go. But to make a $100 million gallon a year plant, you need almost $800 million. And if you say, well, let's make a smaller one, but what happens is the economies of scale start to beat you up, and you really can't make it too much smaller than that. Now we've taken those data, so the capital cost, and we've worked out with operating cost, and then with folks at UC Davis, they've done some geospatial optimization to figure out where should the biorefinery go, where should we get the feedstock from, and then what would be the selling price of the fuel that you'd have to get to make a reasonable amount of money. And again, this is looking at a 100 million gallon a year biorefinery. It uses 1.25 million tons a year of poplar. The best sites, as I mentioned a bit ago, are in western Washington and Oregon, especially sort of in the Chehalis, if you're from Washington region, kind of the middle of western Washington. But most sites, the cost is $4.50 a gallon, well above the $1.30, $1.40 a gallon jet fuel goes right now. And we had a big challenge in aggregating enough low-cost poplar because of the big biorefinery. It was really hard to site a biorefinery in one place and find out how we could get poplar from a reasonable shipping distance. We had to go quite far to bring it in to make it all work. So we switched, before I talk about that, but what we did find is that this is, again, work that was done at Davis, that if you did build one of these biorefineries in an area like Chehalis, some rural area, the benefits, economic benefits would be gigantic. So this is the value added. So that means that this is a payroll, this is the profit of the biorefinery, this is some taxes, some local infrastructure improvements that you would get by having the biorefinery there was on the order of $100 million in direct effects, and then the indirect effects would be about $300 million a year. So the rural economic benefits of having one of these big factories in rural areas was really significant. But economically, it's going to be tough. If we can make it for $4 and it sells for $1.30, so we switched gears and looked at acetic acid. And the nice thing about this is the economies of scale aren't quite so severe in here. I should mention that for fuels, we're talking about 100 million gallons a year, and there's oil refineries that are on the order of 6 to 8 billion gallons a year. So we're not big by oil refinery standards by any means. So for the acetic acid, we could get it with a smaller factory. Instead of 1.25 million tons of biomass a year, we could use 250,000 tons per year. And this provided for a much larger set of good sites to site the biorefinery. And we could make money by selling for about $600 to $650 a ton. Now, when we did this work, when we started this work about 3 years ago, acetic acid was selling for about $800 a ton. So this looked really good. But since that time, China has built 2 or 3 very large acetic acid plants. They use they get natural gas and they convert that into methanol, and then that gets shipped to China, and then they convert that into acetic acid. And the price of acetic acid is now down around $500 a ton. So this isn't looking too good economically anymore, and that's why we're now contemplating producing lactic acid, which doesn't have a petroleum counterpart, and we think a bit more attractive economically. Acetic acid looked pretty good to the environment. So this graph shows the amount of CO2 that would be avoided, CO2 emissions that are avoided by switching from petroleum-based material to a bio-based one. So for example, in the VA, that's vinyl acetate. By switching from petroleum-based acetic acid to the bio-based acetic acid, you would reduce the emissions by 650 tons per every ton of biomass that you used. And so what this shows is that for every ton of biomass, depending on the product that you get it into, there'd be some significant carbon savings. Now, vinyl acetate, VA, is the most significant one. If you produce CMA, this is road salt, this is calcium magnesium acetate, the savings aren't near so good because the acetic acid doesn't get locked up. Ethanol and jet fuel, they also have significant savings, of course, if you use a bio-based product as opposed to the petroleum-based product. All right, so getting off sort of the technical side of things and talking about some of the other elements of the projects that we have, we had a extensive education program. So all the way from sort of middle school up to a professional master's. And a big takeaway from that is when the education folks and the extension group reaches out to students, they find that renewables, talking about fuels and chemicals, are a great way to excite students about science and the environment. So we've held a number of teacher workshops, bioenergy school challenges. We've reached out to lots of different communities, underrepresented, low income, and really got them fired up about renewables and the environment in particular, and also about coming to college to pursue careers in this area. One of the unique things about our CAP program is that we have this significant community college component, and the object here is a 2-year degree to train people to become operators in could be biorefineries, but also waste treatment facilities and a number of other processes, pulp mills, for example. And the great thing about this is I've learned sort of 2 great things about it. One is when we did the curriculum development, we had a lot of people that run these operations in rural communities like waste treatment plants and biodiesel plants. And what we find is they have a very difficult time finding qualified operators. One biodiesel guy was so frustrated that he said if someone came into his place, had a high school degree and could pass the drug test, he would hire him. So they were thrilled to have a program like this producing trained folks that were motivated to be operators. And then the second thing is that our annual meeting was last year was at Walla Walla, where this community college program is located. And we got to meet a number of students, and this program has really changed their lives. I mean, these were students that were having a hard time finding kind of what they wanted to do and where they wanted to work. And here was a prospect of going to community college, getting a 2-year degree, and then lining up a really good job, which makes a living wage that they could really enjoy for their careers. So this has been a great program for us. We have reached out to many, many people here. The extension group here has just done a terrific job of of outreach and energy literacy program. I won't read through all the things that are on the slide here, but you can see the number of webinars, conferences, classroom visits, just all over the place. So people have found out about it. They're interested in this. The word is really spread out that this is a future industry. And finally, we'll have a lot of products. I mean, we'll have research papers and kind of the normal sort of stuff that comes out of a big research project, but there'll be some real strong resources for people to use going forward. So one is the extension people have put together a Grower's Guide, which will have definitive information about how poplar can be grown in the Pacific Northwest, all elements of it. So a lot of the knowledge that we've attained in the project will be embodied in this. The website has a lot of terrific information on it and resources, and if you missed something that I sort of was talking about or you wanted to find out more, I recommend going here because there's just a lot of great information on the website about all the different elements of the project. Oregon State University has this bioenergy YouTube channel. This is for high school students, or it could also we've used it in our introductory classes here for freshman classes. A lot of terrific lectures. Things are explained in very plain language, graphics. It's just a terrific resource if you want to teach or learn more about bioenergy and biofuels in particular. Primarily from UC Davis and now from Arizona State and from Maryland, we'll have a lot of data tools and models. We have a really good poplar growth model, farm budget tool, land suitability application, and then life cycle assessment stuff from the project is ended up in the USDA LCA Digital Commons, so it'll be archived for folks to be used for years to come. Okay, so sort of wrapping things up, we've laid the foundation for renewable fuels and chemicals industry in the Pacific Northwest. We've done a lot of science, so the technology of growing the trees and converting the trees have been well established. We've determined from the analyses where economically viable, where it's not. We've looked at environmental impacts, so there shouldn't be any surprises with regard to any of that. Everything's in good shape there. We got a well-educated workforce. The community college program has really been putting out these folks that can be great operators, but we also have graduates from our undergraduate programs to work as engineers and professional masters going on to be future leaders of the industry. The extension folks have, with all of their outreach, we've built community and policy support, and from everything we can tell, there's a lot of interest and support for this whole thing going forward if the economics can be penciled out. And finally, there's a lot of landowners that are interested in making this happen here. So we've lined up and met lots of them that are excited about planting poplar in their land. So that's set to go too. So the foundation has been laid for the industry. And it's not just kind of our opinion here. This is the USDA feedstock readiness level chart, which is exceedingly small font. I apologize for that. But essentially, when we started the project, we were back in sort of level 2, preliminary feedstock evaluation, and the idea was to get up to full-scale production initiation, so lay the foundation. And if you look at all the things in columns 1, where it says production, market, most of policy, and then linkage to the conversion, we've done all of that. So we're now all the way up to full-scale production initiation for the project. We laid the foundation. Okay, so just a few final thoughts and summary here. We think poplar is a great feedstock for fuels and chemicals, and we think the high cost might be mitigated by monetizing ecosystem services, especially water treatment. Economics for producing fuels from poplar using bioconversion are challenging, and if this is going to happen soon, some policy support is going to happen. Something about carbon tax, cap and trade, something like that. But early biorefineries will probably concentrate on chemicals where the economics look better from poplar, and that can be a bridge to fuel production because the front end of the processes are about the same. The education extension groups have provided essential links within the project, and we've reached out to the broader community. So having them on the project was really crucial for our success. And then finally, I think the USDA should be commended on having these large integrated research projects, because we could not have done the comprehensive assessment and development of the industry without having this multiple sort of group involved and working closely with each other. So finally, I want to thank the USDA for this, letting us do this marvelous project. And of course, I want to thank all these people that are in the photograph here for the hard work that they've done on the project. It's just been marvelous. I'm just a talking head, but we've accomplished a lot. And I thank all of you for your attention.
Okay, thanks everyone. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat box. We also have a webinar coming up next month in November. If you'd like to learn more, it will be Nathan Parker from Arizona State University, and he will be giving some more information on economic evaluation of potential biorefineries with high resolution decision support tools. So he's done some case study work in the Pacific Northwest that is very interesting. So stay tuned for that on Wednesday, November 9th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. If you could answer the questions over in our poll screen on the right side, that would be appreciated. We always like to know what people think about from attending these webinars. If you have questions, type them into the chat box. And I guess while you're doing that, I'll elaborate a bit on the question that Mary Beth Lang had posed earlier about why is poplar a preferred for water treatment. The water treatment plants, they love poplar because poplar can take up a phenomenal amount of water. And the water treatment plants are in the business of getting rid of water, and poplar helps them do that in a very efficient manner. Some wastewater treatment plants also grow alfalfa as an alternative crop, but one of the problems with growing alfalfa is that there is a farmer wanting to go in at certain times of the year and harvest that alfalfa, and when the farmer is harvesting the alfalfa, the wastewater treatment plant can't be applying water. And so in terms of applying water and getting rid of water, it solves a lot of solutions for the wastewater treatment plant. And then poplar is also really good at a process called phytoremediation, and so they're getting rid of excess nutrients, contaminants, metals, pharmaceuticals that are in the wastewater, and able to bring those either into the root zone or take them up into the wood. And so lots of reasons why the wastewater professionals like the poplar. So questions for Rick? I know he did such a great job.
Yeah, just like class.
This webinar will be archived on our Hardwood Biofuels website. It should be available probably on Friday afternoon. So if you have friends and colleagues that wanted to see this today and were not able to, that's where they can check it out later. The other thing I'll mention is that the EPA has recently put through a proposed rule on renewable fuel standards that involve poplar and willow, and so they are seeking feedback for that. And once that's finalized, then industry would be able to get the RINs, the renewable identification numbers, for the poplar and willow-based biofuels. So that's exciting that that's happening soon. Okay, see some folks are typing.
read it?
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
So the question is, what's the ratio of the amount of fuel going into producing the fuel versus the amount of energy coming out? I don't have that number here specifically. It depends a little bit on how we're producing the fuel. If we're producing ethanol, it takes a lot less than if we're producing jet fuel, because you don't need as much hydrogen into the system. In there, if you're fermenting it directly to ethanol, you can take the poplar, produce sugars directly fermented to ethanol, in which case the only fuel for that system is really the fuel that's involved in transporting the biomass to the factory and then the fuel out to the distribution. So that's very small. So we haven't looked at that too much, because we tend to focus on the greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide emissions per ton of biomass, and what the reduction is relative to using petroleum, because that's the goal, is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And for that, when you're producing jet fuel, you can get up to about a 65% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, depending on the process you use. And if you're producing ethanol, which is a bit more efficient, you can almost be carbon neutral, so almost 100% of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to using petroleum.
Okay, thank you, Rick. The next question, growth rates and isoprene emission levels clonally correlated positively or negatively always?
I have not seen any data about the isoprene emissions and the growth rates of the different clones, so I don't know. But I should add that the growth rate of the different clones is a little bit, I have to be a little bit careful about that, because it kind of depends on where you're planting the trees. So you can't say clone A is always the fastest, and because depending on where they are, one or the other could be quicker than another clone.
I might add, there is a webinar that we did last spring, Todd Rosenstein from Portland State University, that all his work on isoprene and poplars, that's posted, archived on our website. So that would be an area where you could go and find out more information. If you have more questions, type them into the chat box. We'll be around for a few more minutes. Oh, lignin.
Oh, lignin. So, in most scenarios so the question is, what happens to the lignin component of the wood? And of course, this is a gigantic question that that people in this business are concerned about. In most of the scenarios we look at, we burn the lignin for steam and electricity to run the factory. And in fact, in many cases, you get enough energy off the lignin to run the whole thing, so you don't need any fossil fuels. But that's a pretty low value use of lignin. And so the issue is can you produce something of higher value from the lignin? And people have proposed lots of different things, carbon products, even carbon fibers, have it be a alternative to phenolic resins, put it into plastics. But none of those have been commercialized in any scale. And of course, the pulp and paper industry has been looking into this for a long time. So I'm optimistic that we'll find some use of the lignin that could help the whole economics of this operation. But I suspect a large part of it will end up being burnt because it's a good fuel that's right there on the factory already, so we don't have to bring another fuel in.
Any additional questions? Please type them into the chat box. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to participate in this webinar. We appreciate it. We will be having the webinar by Nathan Parker in November, and then we will probably start up again with monthly webinars in January. I know sometime either in January or February we will be having a webinar related to policy. We've recently completed a in-depth survey of policymakers in the Pacific Northwest about how they get their information regarding energy, and so that will be happening in January or February, with additional webinars in the spring from different team members. So if there aren't any additional questions, I don't see anybody typing. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a good day. This webinar will be archived on our website probably starting on Friday. And thank you for attending.